Well, first we need to see clearly what the ego is, because sometimes people use that word and they mean different things.
Yeah, they just mean you're being arrogant or...
That's right.
Yes.
It's a much wider thing. It's not just being selfish or being arrogant or thinking yourself superior. That's a small aspect of ego. Ego is basically a self-identification with the stream of thinking. So that collectively, I would say the beginning of ego is actually described at the beginning of the Old Testament, where there is the famous story of the apple, which everybody knows, even non-Bible readers. So it is said there that they ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge and good and evil. And that was when they lost that state that is externalized in the Bible and called paradise. What does that mean? To me, that means it is the arising of the ability to think and to differentiate between things. This is good, this is bad. To make statements like that, to make judgments like that, which is the ability to think, which is so this is a mythological description of what happened to humanity. And at first, the ability to think was not entirely bad. They lost something, they lost a deeper state of connectedness, but I don't think that deeper state of connectedness with being was lost immediately as it's described in the Bible. I believe it took a long time of increased thinking until people reached a point where they derived their entire sense of who they are from the stream of thinking. So what that looks like in a person's life is there is almost, one could say, a mind-made entity which is made up entirely of memories and past conditioning and mental concepts. And this entity, which really is all made up of thinking, people derive their sense of who they are from this mind-made entity. So it's a mind image of who I am. People have split themselves in two. They think there's me and there's myself. Me and my story. The ego is the story of me that people identify with.
You say in the New Earth, ego is no more than this: identification with form, which primarily means thought forms.
Yes, that's right. That's what the ego is.
And you say if evil has any reality, and it has a relative, not an absolute reality, this is also its definition of evil: complete identification with form.
Yes.
Physical forms, thought forms, emotional forms.
That's right.
And that this results in a total unawareness of my connectedness with the whole, my intrinsic oneness with every other, as well as with the source. This forgetfulness is original sin, suffering, or delusion. And that's, when I heard that, I thought, yes, you're right. For every evil act we've ever heard described, or when we think of people as, doing sinful things, it is because of a complete and utter disconnection, a lack of understanding that I am that person that I am attempting to violate. I am that which I am jealous of. I am that.
Yes. It means you cannot sense the aliveness anymore that is in the other person. So you have desensitized yourself to the aliveness. Now, you can only do that if you've already done this to yourself, because by living through mental definitions of who you are, you desensitize yourself to the deeper aliveness of who you truly are beyond thinking.
Okay.
So you become, what arises then is a conceptual identity. I'm this, that, or the other. And then once you are trapped in your own conceptual identity, which is based on thinking and image making by the mind, on your past, then you do the same to others. And the beginning of that is always when you pronounce judgments on another person, and then you believe that judgment to be the truth, calling people, attaching labels to people. That's the beginning of desensitizing yourself to who that human being truly is.
I'm having a conversation here with Eckhart Tolle, who is author of The Power of Now, of course, and A New Earth, Awakening to Your Life's Purpose. So if you are not your story, and most people, I do believe, think that they are. We live in a world where people believe I am my story. I, was born in this family, and this is where I was raised, and these are the things that happened to me, and this is what I did. If you are not your story, then who are you?
That's a very good question, because you cannot deny, of course, that these things exist.
Right.
Your memories of the past, things that you suffered, perhaps even suffering that you might have inflicted on others.
And even not all suffering, my family connections, the people
Yes,
I love.
Yes, you have a so-called past, you have relationships, all that is fine. It is not problematic unless you become totally lost in that dimension alone. So if you have no access to a deeper sense of aliveness or beingness beyond the stream of thinking, because really all that is based on memory. All your past, how do you experience your past? You experience your past as memories. And what are memories? Memories are thoughts in your head. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're totally identified with all these thoughts in your head, then you are completely trapped in your past history. There's no sense of anything beyond that in your life.
Right.
So the important thing is, am I more than my personal history?
Well, you speak in A New Earth, you speak about how advertisers are counting on us to believe in the labels, and that we identify with, particularly in our society, exclusive labels. And the more exclusive the label, the more we identify with it.
Yes, that's right, because the ego wants to be special, one way or another. Every ego wants to be special. And if the ego cannot be special by being superior to others, the ego would also be quite happy with being specially miserable. So you may have seen, witnessed people who are saying, one person says to the other, I have a headache. The other person says, you have a headache? I've had a headache for weeks. So people actually compete, who is more miserable, you or me? It's just the ego that does that is just as big as the ego that says I'm superior to you. Because the ego always wants to be special. So if you recognize in yourself that unconscious need to be special, then you're already half free, because when you recognize all the patterns of the ego, and specialness is one pattern of the ego, another pattern of the ego, it wants to be right all the time. Another pattern of the ego is it actually it loves conflict with others. And that's an amazing thing. Of course, it's unconscious, because the ego defines itself through a boundary that it draws between this is me and that is the other. And that's an important word, because the ego needs to emphasize the otherness of the other person. And that happens on a personal level when people are suspicious of other people's motives and so on. And there's a need for enemies, which is deeply built into the ego. The ego needs enemies because it defines itself through emphasizing the otherness of others. And nations do it, religions do it. The believer, if you identify with one particular religion, and for many people religion is only a mind structure, not in its deepest sense, but for many people a religion is an ideology that they identify with, and then they need the non-believer, the other, because by having the other, they feel their own sense of identity more strongly.
Right, and they need the other in order to feel their own sense of identity.
Yes.
More strongly.
Yes.
The story we tell ourselves is how we perceive the world. And so then when we create the difficulties in our life, it reaffirms the belief that life is hard, that it's really someone out there that's doing it to us, that it's a circumstance in the past that created this. Okay, let's take away the person that did it. Let's shoot him to the moon. Let's erase your past. Now, what are you going to do now? You still got to do something, right? You're still alive. And I say we already know how to do this. We already know how to do this. We're wired to be creators. We're wired to do this. The thing that stops us, for the most part, in doing it is really the hormones of stress, because living in stress constantly is living in survival, and living in survival is living in emergency. In an emergency, it's not a time to create. In an emergency, it's not a time to open your heart. It's not a time to learn. It's not even a time to sit still. So most people then that are living in stress and living in survival, they can't believe in a future yet because it's not a time to create. So getting people to that point where they make up their mind, and they make up their mind enough to begin to think, there's got to be a better way, there's got to be something else. That awakening process typically happens when people reach their lowest denominator. They hit rock bottom, because then they can see themselves through the eyes of somebody else. You feel so altered, you're not returning any texts. You feel so altered, you don't want to go to dinner with your buddies. You feel so altered, you don't want to watch your favorite TV show. You're just disconnected. And that's when you start observing yourself. But my message is, why wait for that? I mean, you can learn and change in pain and suffering, or you can learn and change in joy and inspiration. If you're waking up every morning being defined by a vision of the future instead of the memories of the past, and you get up and you're inspired from an elevated self now instead of a limited self, you could observe the old self from an elevated state instead of that diminished state. And people are doing that. So they are aware of those thoughts. And yes, it takes effort. And if it was easy, everybody would be doing it. But just because you have a thought doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And when you start looking and observing those thoughts, I think you are like Gandalf. Because Gandalf also said, you may not pass. When he meant like that kind of severity when it comes to how we make up our mind about things. That's the kind of energy or intention that begins to create the biggest volume of change in our life. And I've interviewed thousands of people in our work that have healed from really serious health conditions. And I would say about 90% of them, when I ask them, so what happened? The first thing they say all the time is, I just made up my mind. I just made up my mind I was going to do this. And they made a decision with such firm intention that the amplitude of that decision carried a level of energy that was greater than the hardwired programs in their brain and the emotional conditioning in their body. And the choice that they made caused their body to respond to a new mind. In fact, the choice they made became a moment that they would never forget. It was an event. And the stronger the emotion they felt, the more they paid attention to the choice. And in a sense, they were remembering their future. And the body emotionally was getting a sampling, a taste of the future. And they are aligned to that future. And that's when the body's healing began. That's when the miracle started, right in that moment. That's how powerful we really are. Now, what if you did that every day? What if you made up your mind every single day you weren't going to get up from your meditation until you were that person you wanted to be? Game on now. Because you'd have to do battle with all the things that are not consistent with it. And that's exactly how our brain works. So then, if you want to be wealthy, you can't feel lack. You want to be a master, you can't judge